The jungle was alive with sounds that shouldn't exist. Captain Elias Vance groaned as he crawled from the wreckage of his downed ship, the smell of scorched metal and burnt wiring filling his lungs. His left arm hung limp at his side, dislocated from the impact, and his forehead dripped blood into his right eye. But he was alive. For now. He stumbled forward, taking stock of his surroundings. The thick canopy above filtered sunlight into a dim, eerie glow. Alien foliage stretched in every direction. Some plants pulsing faintly as if they had their own heartbeat. Something rustled nearby, too heavy to be the wind. Elias pulled his sidearm, a compact plasma pistol with 2 charges left. It wasn't much, but it'd have to do. "Welcome to paradise," he muttered bitterly, his voice echoing in the stillness. The crash hadn't been an accident. He'd been running a reconnaissance mission in neutral space, keeping tabs on Dominion patrols. The Exarquel had found him first, their sleek insectoid fighters swarming his ship before he could even react. One lucky hit to his engine had sent him spiraling into this forsaken world. Elias winced as he reset his shoulder against the trunk of a massive tree, the dull pop of bone sliding back into place, sending a fresh wave of nausea through him. He forced himself to focus. Survival came first. He'd done this before, dozens of times on alien worlds during the frontier wars. His implants were fried, and his beacon was dead, but Elias Vance wasn't the type to wait around for a rescue. The sound of plasma fire cut through the air, sharp and distant. He froze. That wasn't Dominion tech, at least not entirely. The distinct hum of a Coalition rifle was unmistakable, and it was close. He crept toward the noise, moving as quietly as he could. The scene that unfolded before him was worse than he'd expected. A Coalition squad, 4 alien soldiers, including a towering Saurian and a feline-like sharpshooter, were pinned down in the clearing. Opposite them, a trio of Exarquel warriors scuttled across the terrain, their chitinous armor reflecting the sunlight. The insectoids moved with terrifying precision, their bioplasma weapons carving craters into the ground around their enemies. Elias dropped low, keeping to the shadows. He had no love for the Coalition. They'd abandoned humanity during the early wars, but he hated the Exarquel more. The Dominion was a cancer on the galaxy, enslaving or exterminating anything that stood in its way. "Damn it," he muttered, knowing full well he couldn't ignore the situation. 2 shots, that's all he had. Carefully, he took aim at the nearest Exarquel. The shot was perfect, catching the warrior in the joint between its head and thorax. The creature dropped instantly. The clearing erupted into chaos. The Coalition squad turned to see their unlikely savior just as the remaining Exarquel charged toward Elias. He gritted his teeth, preparing for a fight he wasn't sure he could win. Elias hit the ground hard, rolling out of the path of the charging Exarquel warrior. The insectoid let out a shrill, otherworldly screech as it slashed at him with razor-sharp appendages. Elias ducked under the strike, aiming his plasma pistol point-blank at its abdomen. He squeezed the trigger. The shot burned through its chitin, and the creature collapsed, twitching as its body dissolved into a pool of acrid-smelling ichor. Elias didn't have time to celebrate. Another one was closing in fast, its claws raised high. "Down!" Someone shouted behind him. Elias dropped instinctively as a bolt of blue plasma whizzed over his head, striking the Exarquel cleanly in the face. Its head exploded in a burst of fluorescent green, and the remains crumpled to the ground. Elias turned to see the feline-like Coalition soldier lowering her rifle, her golden eyes narrowing at him. "Human," she hissed, the word dripping with disdain. "Last I checked." Elias shot back, breathing hard. "You're welcome, by the way." The rest of the Coalition squad emerged cautiously from cover, weapons still trained on Elias. The leader, a massive Saurian alien with scales that shimmered like molten silver, stepped forward. "Who are you? And why are you here?" The Saurian demanded in a deep, guttural voice. "Captain Elias Vance," he replied, holstering his now useless pistol. I crashed here after a Dominion ambush. Same as you, I guess. The Saurian's eyes narrowed. We don't need your help. Elias gestured to the smoldering bodies of the HFY. Could have fooled me. The feline hissed again, baring sharp teeth. The Coalition doesn't ally with your kind, human. You're a liability. Always have been. Elias rolled his eyes. He'd heard it all before. The Coalition had refused to come to humanity's aid during the frontier wars, labeling them reckless primitives, unfit for the galactic stage. Humanity had survived anyway, earning a reputation for defiance and unpredictability. It was a grudge that ran deep. Great, Elias said, brushing dirt off his jacket. Feel free to handle the next wave without me. As if on cue, a deep rumble shook the ground. The group froze, their eyes darting toward the jungle's edge. From the shadows emerged something far worse than the HFY. It was a drone, 8 feet tall, its sleek metal body bristling with weaponry. Its single red optic glowed menacingly as it scanned the area. Behind it, more drones emerged, their movements unnervingly precise. Reinforcements, Elias muttered. Fantastic. The Saurian barked orders, the Coalition soldiers scrambling into defensive positions. Elias, on the other hand, didn't bother hiding his frustration. Guess you're stuck with me, he said, pulling a combat knife from his boot. The feline soldier sneered. Just don't get in the way. The drones opened fire, their weapons lighting up the jungle in a hail of plasma bolts. Elias dove behind cover, cursing under his breath. This was not how he imagined his day going. As the first wave of drones advanced, Elias couldn't help but grin despite the chaos. Surviving this mess would take every dirty trick he knew. And if there was one thing humans excelled at, it was playing dirty. The clearing erupted into chaos as the drones pressed forward, their precision fire forcing Elias and the Coalition soldiers into cover. Plasma bolts ripped through trees, sending shards of glowing bark flying through the air. Elias crouched behind a large root, assessing the situation. The Coalition squad was well trained, but their strategy lacked flexibility. The Saurian commander barked orders in a steady rhythm, moving his troops in predictable patterns. The feline sniper was doing the most damage, picking off drones with careful precision, but the sheer number of enemies was overwhelming. You've got to be kidding me, Elias muttered, scanning for opportunities. He spotted what he needed. A supply crate dropped during the Coalition's earlier skirmish. If it had grenades or anything explosive, it could turn the tide. The problem was the crate was out in the open, with drones sweeping the area. Elias tapped his earpiece, a futile instinct. Of course, it was fried. He gritted his teeth and called out, "Silver scales." The Saurian's head snapped toward him, his expression a mix of annoyance and confusion. "It's Commander Durex," he growled. "What is it, human?" "Cover me," Elias shouted, already sprinting toward the crate. "Wait, you?" Too late. Plasma bolts sizzled past as Elias zigzagged, diving behind a toppled tree trunk just as a drone locked onto him. He popped his head up for a split second, marking the drone's position before throwing a chunk of debris to his left. The distraction worked. The drone's optic shifted, giving him the opening he needed to reach the crate. Inside, he found what he was looking for. Thermal charges. "Bingo," he said, grabbing a handful. He armed the first charge, peeked over his cover, and hurled it toward the densest cluster of drones. The device landed with a satisfying clink before erupting into a fiery explosion that sent shards of metal flying. "Now we're talking," Elias said, grinning. The explosion shifted the tide. The drones faltered, their formation breaking just enough for the Coalition soldiers to push forward. Commander Durex's booming voice rallied his troops, and the feline sniper took advantage of the chaos to pick off stragglers. Elias armed another charge and tossed it toward a drone that was flanking the Coalition's left side. The explosion tore through it, clearing the way for Durex's heavy gunner to advance. "Not bad for a liability, huh?" Elias called over the din. Durex gave him a reluctant nod, the closest thing to approval Elias figured he'd get. As the last drone fell, silence returned to the jungle, broken only by the crackle of fires and the labored breathing of the survivors. "You're reckless," Durex said, approaching Elias. "Reckless works," Elias replied, wiping sweat from his brow. "You'd still be pinned if it weren't for me." The feline sniper hissed, her tail lashing. "We don't need your help." Elias smirked. "You're welcome anyway." Before the argument could escalate, a distant rumble echoed through the jungle. The group froze, their eyes turning toward the horizon. "That's not good," Elias said, his grin fading. Durex nodded grimly. "If the drones were here, the Dominion isn't far behind." Elias sighed, already checking his gear. "Looks like we got a bigger problem." The rumble grew louder, a deep guttural sound that resonated through the jungle floor. Elias exchanged a grim look with Commander Durex, the unspoken understanding that the drones were only the vanguard. Whatever was coming next would be worse. Much worse. "We need to move," Durex barked, gesturing toward the denser jungle. "There's an abandoned Sarquel facility 2 clicks from here. If we make it, we can regroup and plan." "Plan?" Elias scoffed, falling in line with the group. "You mean survive, right? Big difference." Durex growled but didn't argue. The coalition squad fell into formation, with the feline sniper, Zerika, covering the rear. Elias stuck to the middle, keeping his eyes on the path ahead, and his ears tuned to the unnatural hum that followed them. The jungle thickened as they advanced, the foliage pressing closer. The towering trees cast long shadows, and the faint bioluminescent glow of the plant life added an eerie edge to their surroundings. Every sound, chirps, clicks, and rustles, felt like a prelude to disaster. Facility's automated defenses might still be active, Durex said, his voice low. "We'll need your expertise to bypass them." Elias snorted. "You mean you need someone expendable to poke the hornet's nest?" Zerika's tail flicked in irritation. For once, the human understands his role. "Play nice, kitty cat." Elias shot back, earning a sharp hiss. Before their bickering could escalate, a high-pitched whine cut through the air. Everyone froze. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a faint blue glow filtering through the trees. "Drones," Zerika whispered, her ears flattening. Elias's stomach tightened. This time, the drones weren't marching. They were flying. He caught a glimpse of them as they emerged, sleek, predatory machines, their rotary blades cutting through the air with lethal efficiency. "We can't outrun those," Elias said. Durex nodded. "Then we fight." The squad spread out, taking cover in the underbrush. Elias crouched behind a fallen log, gripping a thermal charge. "We'll draw them in, hit them with everything we've got. But don't waste ammo. They're testing us, not committing." Zerika glared at him, but didn't argue. The first drone swept into the clearing, its red optic scanning the area. Elias held his breath, waiting for the right moment. The drone hovered closer, then closer still. "Now," Elias shouted, lobbing his charge. The explosion tore through the drone, sending sparks and shrapnel flying. 2 more swooped in immediately, their weapons blazing. Plasma bolts seared the air, forcing the group to scatter. Elias ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding a blast that scorched the ground where he'd been. He pulled his knife and lunged at the nearest drone, jamming the blade into its exposed circuitry. It sparked violently, spinning out of control before crashing into a tree. "Facilities dead ahead," Durex bellowed. Elias glanced up. Through the trees, he could see the faint outline of a structure, sharp, angular, and unmistakably Tarquel. It loomed like a tombstone, promising safety and danger in equal measure. "This better be worth it," Elias muttered, breaking into a sprint as the surviving drones closed in. They reached the facility's perimeter just as the drones let out an ear-splitting shriek, signaling reinforcements. Elias didn't wait for an invitation. He slammed his fist against the control panel beside the entrance, working the alien interface with practiced urgency. "Hurry up," Zerika snapped, her rifle firing in quick bursts. "Almost there," Elias growled, sweat dripping down his face. With a final tap, the door slid open. "Inside," Direx ordered. The squad piled into the facility as Elias sealed the door behind them. For a moment, the only sound was the pounding of their hearts. Elias turned to Direx, breathing hard. "Well, Commander, welcome to the Hornet's Nest." Inside the Charquel facility, the air was colder, stale, and thick with the hum of dormant machinery. The walls were made of smooth, dark material that shimmered faintly under the dim lighting. Symbols in the Charquel's jagged script glowed softly, their meaning lost on most of the group, except Elias. "Charquel tech," he muttered, running his fingers over the alien script. "Hive architecture. Biomechanical systems. I've seen this before." Direx's tail flicked impatiently. "Can you make sense of it?" "Enough to know we're standing in their backyard," Elias said, turning to face the squad. "This isn't just a facility. It's a node, a processing center. The Dominion doesn't set up places like this unless they're important." Zerika folded her arms, her golden eyes narrowing. "So you're saying we're in the middle of something critical to the Dominion's plans?" Elias smirked. "More like we've just walked into the brain of the operation. If we're lucky, there's data here that explains why they're so interested in this sector. If we're unlucky," one of the other soldiers, a wiry insectoid member of the squad, asked nervously. Elias gave a grim chuckle. "Then we just woke up the whole hive." The hum in the air grew louder, almost as if the facility itself was responding to their presence. Direx raised a scaled hand to silence the group, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the shadows. "Stay sharp," he growled. "The Dominion doesn't leave their tech undefended." The group moved cautiously through the facility, their boots echoing against the metallic floor. Elias kept to the rear, his eyes darting to the ceiling, where strange cables pulsed like veins carrying blood. "Place gives me the creeps," Zerika muttered, her ears twitching at every sound. "It should," Elias replied. "The Charquel don't just build structures, they grow them. This whole facility is alive in some way." Direx shot him a sharp look. "Alive. Not sentient, but reactive," Elias explained. "If we trip the wrong system, it'll treat us like an infection and send, well, whatever it's got to deal with us." As if on cue, a deep mechanical groan reverberated through the walls. The lights flickered, and suddenly, a section of the floor shifted, revealing a concealed platform. Rising from it were humanoid figures, tall, sleek, and terrifyingly familiar. "Auto Sentinels," Elias said, his voice grim. The Sentinels' red optics flared to life, and their limbs unfolded into a mix of sharp weapons and energy cannons. "Defensive formation," Direx barked, raising his plasma rifle. The first Sentinel lunged, its bladed arm slicing through the air. Direx intercepted it with a well-aimed shot, but two more advanced on the group. Elias ducked under a strike, jamming a thermal charge into the Sentinel's chest and kicking it backward. The explosion lit up the room, but more Sentinels emerged, their movements unnervingly precise. "We're not going to win this head-on," Elias shouted, taking cover behind a console. "We need to find the core and shut it down before it sends reinforcements." Direx growled, his tail lashing. "And where's the core?" Elias scanned the room, his eyes locking on a large conduit pulsing with light. "There. If we overload that, we can short out the whole facility, or at least buy us time to escape." "Escape?" Zerika snapped, her rifle blazing as she covered the flank. "You dragged us in here, human. You better have a real plan." "I do." Elias shot back, arming another charge. "It's called improvisation." The group fought their way toward the conduit, the Sentinels closing in from every direction. Elias's mind raced as he calculated the odds. They weren't good, but if humanity had taught the galaxy anything, it was that they didn't play by the rules. Elias sprinted toward the conduit, weaving through a hailstorm of plasma bolts and razor-edged strikes from the sentinels. Behind him, the coalition soldiers fought valiantly, their synchronized movements a stark contrast to his unpredictable chaos. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning metal and ozone as sparks rained down from the ceiling. The conduit loomed ahead, a pulsating column of energy encased in a biomechanical shell. Veins of glowing blue light pulsed through its surface, sending power to every corner of the facility. Elias knew one thing for certain. Destroying it wouldn't just cripple the sentinels, it might blow the entire place sky-high. "Cover me," Elias shouted over the din. "Do you ever stop giving orders?" Zerika growled, her tail lashing as she fired a precise shot that downed an advancing sentinel. Elias didn't bother replying. He slid to a stop beside the conduit, yanking a toolkit from his belt. The interface panel was alien, a seamless blend of organic and synthetic materials. He grimaced, his fingers flying over the controls. "Of course, it's in Exarquel," he muttered. The symbols danced across the panel, unfamiliar yet strangely intuitive. His time scavenging alien tech had its perks. He could read just enough to cause trouble. "What are you doing?" Drex demanded, firing a burst of plasma that dismembered a sentinel. "Trying to overload the system," Elias replied, his voice tense. "If I can force the core into a feedback loop, it'll fry the sentinel's command link. But it's not going to be pretty." "Define not pretty," Zerika hissed as she ducked under a sentinel's blade. "Best case, we short out the sentinels," Elias said, his hands moving faster. "Worst case, we turn this place into a crater. Either way, I hope you brought good running shoes." The panel beeped angrily, flashing red. Elias cursed under his breath. The Exarquel had locked critical systems behind multiple layers of security, and he didn't have time to crack them all. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small circular device, a human-made bypass tool. "Let's see how you like human ingenuity," he said, slapping the device onto the panel. The tool hummed, its light flickering as it worked to brute force its way through the alien encryption. The conduit began to pulse erratically, the lights dimming and flaring in chaotic patterns. "It's working," Elias shouted, though the rumble beneath his feet suggested otherwise. The sentinels faltered, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. But instead of collapsing, they began emitting a high-pitched whine. "What now?" Zerika demanded, her ears flattening. "They're switching to local control," Elias realized, his stomach dropping. "The core's disruption isn't enough. They're still operational." Drex snarled. "Then finish this before we're overwhelmed." Elias gritted his teeth, yanking a thermal charge from his belt. He set the timer to 10 seconds and slapped it onto the conduit. "Time to go," he yelled, sprinting away. The squad followed, retreating through the chaos as the sentinels closed in. The facility groaned like a wounded beast, its walls shuddering as the conduit's power destabilized. The explosion came seconds later, a deafening roar that sent shockwaves through the jungle. The squad barely made it outside as the facility erupted in flames, chunks of debris raining down around them. Elias collapsed against a tree, coughing from the smoke. "Well," he said between gasps, "that's one way to send a message." Drex loomed over him, his silver scales glinting in the firelight. "You're reckless, human, but you may have just bought us a chance." Zerika glared at Elias, her tail flicking angrily. "I hate to admit it, but he's right." "What now?" Elias grinned despite the ache in his body. "Now, we figure out what's left of the Dominion's plan, and make sure they regret ever stepping foot on this planet." The jungle smoldered behind them as the squad regrouped, battered but alive. The explosion had left a jagged scar across the horizon, and the faint hum of Dominion machinery had quieted, for now. Yet Elias couldn't shake the feeling that they were far from safe. Drex paced back and forth, his tail flicking irritably. "We've disrupted their operation here, But the Dominion isn't going to let this slide. That was just one node. There will be others. Elias leaned against a tree, catching his breath. True, but the Sentinels weren't just guarding that facility. They were connected to it. When we blew the core, we didn't just destroy their command link. We likely fried part of their network. Zerika's ears perked up, her eyes narrowing. Meaning? Meaning, Elias said, pulling a small datapad from his jacket. Whatever was in that facility might have been transmitted before it all went kaboom. And lucky for us, I grabbed this beauty from one of the terminals while you were all busy saving my skin. He held up the datapad triumphantly, the screen flickering with Xarquel symbols. Durex growled. And you didn't think to mention this earlier. Elias shrugged. Didn't seem like the right time. Besides, I wasn't sure it survived the blast. The Saurian commander muttered something under his breath that sounded like an insult, but Elias ignored him. He tapped at the datapad, his brow furrowing as he navigated the alien interface. Zerika loomed over his shoulder, her tail swishing impatiently. What are you looking for? Anything that tells us why the Dominion is so obsessed with this planet. Elias replied. It's not just the jungle. They could have glassed this place from orbit if they wanted it wiped clean. They're here for something specific. As he worked, fragments of data began to emerge. Maps, schematics, and strange patterns that looked like energy signatures. Then he found it, a symbol that sent a chill down his spine. The coalition soldiers gathered around as the screen displayed a diagram of what appeared to be a massive subterranean structure, its design unmistakably Xarquel. That's impossible, Zerika said, her voice barely above a whisper. Durex's eyes narrowed. What is it? Elias swallowed hard. A vault. The Xarquel didn't just abandon this planet. They left something behind. And if the Dominion's this interested, it's not just old tech. It's something big, dangerous, even. Zerika's ears flattened. The kind of thing they could use to turn the tide of the war. Elias nodded grimly. Or worse, if this is a weapon, it might make the Sentinels look like children's toys. Before anyone could respond, the jungle shuddered violently. A low, resonant roar echoed through the air, sending birds and creatures scattering. They know, Durex said, his voice filled with dread. Elias pocketed the datapad and grabbed his rifle. Then we need to move. If the Dominion's after that vault, we're not letting them open it. And if we get there first? Zerika asked, her tone laced with skepticism. Elias gave her a crooked grin. Then we make sure they regret it. Humanity's good at breaking things, remember? The squad exchanged wary glances, but fell into formation, their steps quickening as they moved deeper into the jungle. Overhead, the sound of approaching Dominion dropships grew louder, the faint red glow of their searchlights piercing through the treetops. As they pressed on, Elias couldn't shake the weight of the datapad in his pocket, or the question gnawing at the edge of his mind. Whatever lay inside that vault, it wasn't just a relic of the past. It was a game changer. And whether they liked it or not, they were about to find out if it was humanity's salvation or its doom. The jungle thinned as they approached the vault, its presence a stark contrast to the natural chaos around it. The massive structure jutted out of the earth, its surface smooth and black, pulsating faintly with alien energy. Strange runes glowed along its edges, casting an eerie light that danced across the faces of the squad. Elias paused, his breath catching in his throat. This is it, he said, almost to himself. The Xarquel really didn't want anyone opening this. Durex growled, his claws flexing. And yet here we are, racing the Dominion to do exactly that. What's the plan, human? Elias scanned the structure, noting the faint shimmer of an energy shield protecting the entrance. The Dominion wasn't far behind. The roar of dropships grew louder, accompanied by the mechanical whine of more drones. We go in, Elias said, pulling out the datapad. The shield is Xarquel tech. I can use what's on here to override it, but once we're inside, we're on borrowed time. The Dominion will follow. Do we even know what's in there? Zerika asked, her rifle held tight. Nope, Elias admitted with a grin. But isn't that half the fun? Zerika muttered something that sounded like a curse, but she took her position, covering the perimeter. Elias knelt by the control panel embedded in the vault's surface, the datapad connected by a series of thin, sparking cables. His hands worked quickly, deciphering the alien symbols as the shield flickered. Behind them, the jungle exploded with noise. Dominion drones burst through the trees, their weapons blazing. Hold them off. Direx roared, his plasma rifle cutting down the first wave. Zerika and the others opened fire, their weapons lighting up the darkness. The air filled with the screech of drones and the crack of energy bolts. Elias worked faster, sweat dripping down his face as the shield shimmered, faltered, and finally dissipated with a low hum. Got it, he shouted, leaping to his feet. Inside now. The squad retreated into the vault, Zerika tossing a grenade behind them that sent a wave of fire through the jungle. The heavy doors slid shut with a deafening thud, sealing them in darkness. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the interior of the vault lit up, revealing a cavernous chamber lined with crystalline structures. The air hummed with energy, and at the center of the room stood a massive sphere, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe. That's it, Elias whispered, his voice filled with awe. The squad approached cautiously, their weapons raised. The sphere pulsed faintly, and as they drew closer, it reacted, spinning faster and emitting a low, resonant hum. What is it? Direx asked, his tone wary. A weapon, Elias said, his voice hollow. But not just any weapon. This thing doesn't just destroy, it rewrites. Rewrites. Zerika's ears flattened. Elias nodded. Matter, energy, even thought. The Exarquel weren't just fighting wars. They were rewriting reality itself. Before anyone could respond, the vault shook violently. The Dominion had breached the outer layer. Time was running out. Elias turned to the group. We can't let them have this. If they activate it, they'll rewrite the galaxy in their image. There's only one option. Direx growled. You're suggesting we destroy it. Elias met his gaze. Yes, and I can do it, but it means staying behind. No, Zerika snapped. There has to be another way. There isn't, Elias said, his voice firm. This is the kind of power no one should have. Not the Dominion, not the Coalition, not us. The vault shook again, cracks forming in the walls. The others hesitated, but Direx nodded grimly. Do it. We'll hold them off as long as we can. Elias worked quickly, setting charges around the sphere while the squad prepared for the final stand. The doors buckled under the Dominion's assault, and soon the room was filled with the sound of gunfire and the clash of metal. As the charges beeped, Elias looked up at the squad, a crooked smile on his face. Hey, if anyone writes this down, make sure I sound cooler than I was, all right. Zerika glared at him, but gave a reluctant nod. Don't mess this up, human. The squad retreated, leaving Elias alone with the sphere. He stared at it for a moment, marveling at its beauty and terror. Then he triggered the charges. The explosion lit up the jungle, a blinding flash that shook the planet itself. The Dominion forces were annihilated, and the vault was reduced to molten slag. Far above, in the Coalition dropship that had extracted the surviving squad, Zerika stared out the window, her ears twitching. He was reckless, she muttered. But he was human, Direx said, his voice heavy with respect. And for once, that was enough.